Let me tell you about a man named Hugh Glass. In the late summer of 1823, Glass was scouting ahead of a fur-trapping expedition through the Grand River Valley in present-day South Dakota. He was tall for his time, weathered by years on the frontier, a former sailor who had lived among the Pawnee and learned how to read the land like other men read scripture. The party he traveled with was led by a man named Andrew Henry, and they were pushing deep into country that the Arikara had recently turned hostile. Glass walked through tall grass and willow thickets along a riverbank, his rifle resting across one arm, and somewhere in that brush, a grizzly bear stood up. She was a sow with 2 cubs. The bear hit him before he could raise his weapon. She drove him into the dirt and tore open his back from shoulder to hip with a single sweep of her claws. She bit down on his neck and shook him the way a dog shakes a rabbit. By the time the rest of the men came running, Glass was lying in a pool of his own blood with his scalp peeled forward over his eyes, his throat ripped open so badly you could see the air bubbling through the wound when he tried to breathe, and one of his legs broken in 2 places. The men killed the bear. Then they looked at Hugh Glass and they made the decision every mountain man dreaded making, which was to wait for him to die. He would not die. For 2 days he lay there breathing through a hole in his neck. Henry could not afford to wait any longer. The Arikara were close, the country was dangerous, and then dragging a dying man across the wilderness would get the entire party killed. So Henry offered a bounty. 2 volunteers, John Fitzgerald and a teenage boy named Jim Bridger, would stay behind. They would tend to Glass until he passed, bury him properly, and then catch up with the company. They took the money. They watched him for 5 more days. And then, when the wind shifted and they heard movement in the trees, they took his rifle, his knife, his flint and steel, his powder horn, and his bedroll, and they left him there alive in a shallow grave they had already dug. They told the company he had died. Hugh Glass woke up in his own grave with no weapons, no fire, no food, and no way to walk. The closest American outpost was Fort Kiowa, 200 miles away across country, crawling with Arikara war parties. It was September. So the first frost was coming. And this is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about something much darker. Because to understand what Hugh Glass did next, you have to understand what winter meant to the men who lived in the Rocky Mountain wilderness in the 1820s. Winter in the high country was not weather. It was a predator. The trappers had a name for the cold that came down from the Canadian Rockies in late October. They called it the White Death. Temperatures in the Yellowstone Basin and the Wind River Range routinely dropped to 40 and even 50 degrees below zero. At those temperatures, exposed human skin freezes solid in under 3 minutes. The water in your eyes begins to crystallize. Your breath turns into ice on your beard, and the weight of that ice can crack a man's teeth from clenching against the cold. Inside your body, things are happening that your mind cannot understand. Your blood begins to thicken. Your heart slows. Your fingers and toes lose blood flow as your body sacrifices the extremities to keep your core alive. And when those extremities freeze, the tissue inside them turns black and begins to rot while you are still alive to watch it happen. Mountain men called this the Black Creep. There are journal entries from trappers in the 1830s describing men who woke up in their lean-tos to find their toes had snapped off in the night, like dry twigs. There are accounts of frontiersmen using their hunting knives to cut away frozen flesh from their own feet, of then cauterizing the wounds with the red-hot barrel of a rifle pressed against the bone. One man, a French-Canadian voyageur named Antoine Beauchamp, was found in 1831 in a cabin near the Yellowstone, with both of his hands missing. He had cut them off himself with an axe, one at a time, after gangrene set in from frostbite. He survived. He lived another 14 years on the frontier with hooks tied to the stumps of his wrists. Nobody knows how he reloaded a rifle. But the worst part of extreme cold is not the pain. The worst part is what it does to your mind. When the human body drops below a certain temperature, the brain begins to short-circuit in a very particular way. It tells you that you are burning up. Trappers found bodies of men in the deep snow who had stripped completely naked before they died. Their clothes folded neatly beside them as if they had laid down to sleep on a summer afternoon. The phenomenon has a name. It is called paradoxical undressing, and it kills more people in cold weather than the cold itself. Mountain men feared it more than wolves. They feared it more than the Blackfeet, because the cold did not just kill you. It made you walk willingly into your own grave and take off your coat first. This was the world Hugh Glass had to crawl through. He started by setting his own leg. He found 2 straight branches and used strips torn from his own shirt to bind the bone. He could not stand. He could not walk. So he crawled. He pulled himself across the prairie on his elbows and one good knee, dragging his shattered leg behind him. The wounds on his back were full of maggots, and Glass would later say that the maggots saved his life because they ate the rotting flesh and kept the gangrene from spreading. He drank from puddles. He ate wild berries when he could find them, and when he could not, he ate insects and grass roots and bark. At one point, he came across a pack of wolves bringing down a young bison. He waited until the wolves had eaten their fill and wandered off, and then he crawled to the carcass and ate the raw meat with his bare hands while it was still warm. That bison probably saved his life, but it also taught him something the old trappers already knew. The men who survived the worst winters in the Rocky Mountains did not survive by being tough. They survived by being willing to do things that would have horrified them 6 months earlier. And the first of these things, the one almost every mountain man eventually learned, was the trick of the buffalo coffin. When the cold became truly killing, when a man could not start a fire and could not find shelter and knew with absolute certainty that he would freeze to death before sunrise, there was one thing he could do. He could find a fresh kill, or make one if he had the strength, and he could open the belly of a large animal, scoop out the steaming organs, and crawl inside the gut cavity. The body heat of the animal, even after death, would keep a man alive through the night. In the morning, the carcass would be frozen solid around him, and he would have to cut his way out with a knife. Trappers wrote about waking up sealed inside dead elk and dead buffalo, the smell of blood and bile soaked into their clothes for weeks afterward, but alive, always alive. There is a written account from a Hudson's Bay trapper named Mackenzie who described crawling inside a dead moose during a blizzard in the Athabasca country and lying there for 2 full days while the storm raged outside. When he finally cut his way out, he said the inside of the animal had been the only warm place left in the world. The trick worked, but it was only the beginning of what they did to live. In the deep cold, the human body needs enormous amounts of fat just to maintain its core temperature. The mountain men knew this, even if they did not know the science. They ate things that would make a modern stomach revolt. They drank fresh animal blood straight from the throat of a kill, hot and salty and full of the iron their starving bodies craved. They ate raw bone marrow scooped from cracked femurs with their fingers. They ate the stomach contents of herbivores, the half-digested grass and lichens, because it was sometimes the only source of plant matter in a frozen landscape. They made a paste called pemmican by pounding dried meat together with rendered fat and berries, and a single pound of pemmican contained enough calories to keep a man walking through the snow for an entire day. The fat was everything. The fat was the difference between living and dying. Trappers in the Rocky Mountains were known to drink cups of melted bear grease the way other men drank coffee. They smeared it on their faces to prevent frostbite. They ate it by the handful. Some of them carried small leather bags of rancid fat that they would chew on while they walked because the rotting grease produced more body heat than fresh meat could. This was the diet that kept them alive. And for the men who could not find food at all, there was one final option that nobody wrote about openly, but everybody on the frontier understood. In the winter of 1873, decades after Hugh Glass crawled across the plains, a prospector named Alfred Packer led a party of 5 men into the San Juan Mountains of Colorado looking for gold. They got caught by an early snowstorm. 2 months later, Packer walked out alone, well-fed, carrying strips of meat in his pack. The bodies of his 5 companions were found in a clearing the next spring. They had been butchered. Packer was tried for cannibalism, convicted, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. But here is the part of the story most people never hear. When the old mountain men in Colorado heard what Packer had done, a very few of them were horrified. Some of them defended him, because almost every trapper who had spent more than 3 winters in the high country had either seen it happen or come close to doing it themselves. There was an unwritten rule among the trappers. When a man died in winter camp, his body did not always go in the ground. Sometimes it went in the cooking pot. They called it the long meat. They did not talk about it when they came back to the settlements in the spring. They did not write about it in their journals. But the old-timers knew, and the old-timers passed it down to the younger men with a single piece of advice. If it comes to that, do not feel guilty. The dead do not need their bodies anymore. The living do. This was the world Hugh Glass crawled through. A world where the rules of civilization ended at the tree line and were replaced by the rules of the cold. By October, Glass was still moving. He had figured out how to walk with a crutch made from a fallen branch. He covered between 2 and 5 miles a day, and the temperatures were dropping fast. He spent his nights huddled in hollow logs, in shallow caves, and once, according to his own account, inside the carcass of a young pronghorn antelope he killed by throwing rocks. He was not the only desperate man in those mountains that winter, and he was not even the most desperate. 14 years before Hugh Glass began his crawl, another mountain man named John Colter had run for his life across the same country with even less to his name. Colter had been a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and after the expedition ended, he stayed in the wilderness as a trapper. In the autumn of 1809, he was captured by a Blackfeet war party along the Jefferson River. The Blackfeet hated trappers. They had killed Colter's partner already, and they were preparing to kill him too, but the chief decided to give him a chance for sport. They stripped him completely naked. They took his moccasins. They pointed at the open plain and told him to run. Then they sent their fastest warriors after him with spears. John Colter ran. He ran barefoot across cactus and sharp stones until the bottoms of his feet were ribbons of bloody flesh. He ran until his nose burst from the strain and the blood poured down his chest. He killed the lead pursuer with the man's own spear and kept running. He ran for 6 days and 6 nights through country that was already turning cold, naked, with no food and no fire, and somehow he reached a fur company outpost on the Yellowstone alive. The men at the outpost did not recognize him at first. His skin had been burned almost black by the sun and the cold, his feet were rotting, and he could not speak. He recovered. He went back into the mountains. Colter died in 1813, peacefully, on a farm in Missouri. He was 48 years old. He never told anyone exactly what he ate during those 6 days of running. The mountain men were not heroes, no matter what the dime novels would later say about them. They were something stranger and harder to name. A man named John Johnson, who would later become known as Liver-Eating Johnson. I'd spent 25 years in the Crow country waging a private war against the tribe that had killed his wife. The legend says he killed and scalped over 300 Crow warriors during those decades, and that he ate the liver of every man he killed because he believed it would give him the man's strength. Most of his killings happened in winter. He hunted his enemies through blizzards. He slept in snow caves. He lived on dried elk meat and human liver for months at a time, and when other trappers met him on the trail, they crossed to the other side of the path because there was something in his eyes that did not look like a man anymore. Johnson did finally make peace with the Crow late in his life. They gave him a Crow name. It translated roughly to the man who walked through winter and came out empty. That phrase haunts the entire history of the mountain men, the man who walked through winter and came out empty. Because the cold did not just take fingers and toes and lives. It took something else from them. something they could not get back. In March of 1824, 6 months after he had been left for dead, Hugh Glass walked into Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River. He had crawled and limped and walked over 200 miles through hostile country in the worst conditions the American interior could throw at a man. His scars had healed into thick ropes of pink tissue across his back and neck. He could speak again, though his voice was permanently damaged from the throat wound. He had only one thing on his mind. He wanted to find John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger. He wanted his rifle back. And he wanted to kill them. He found Bridger first, at a fur company post on the Yellowstone. Bridger was 19 years old. He was terrified. He stood in front of Hugh Glass and waited to die. And Hugh Glass, after staring at him for a long moment, told the boy that he forgave him because he was young and afraid and had been following orders. Then he went looking for Fitzgerald. He found him months later at Fort Atkinson, but by then Fitzgerald had enlisted in the United States Army, and killing a soldier would have made Glass a hanged man. So Glass took back his rifle, said his piece, and walked away. Hugh Glass died in the winter of 1833. He was killed by a war party of Arikara on the frozen Yellowstone River, only a few miles from the spot where the bear had nearly finished him a decade earlier. He was somewhere around 50 years old. But they never found his body. The mountains kept him. And here is the last thing I want to tell you, the part that the books leave out and the documentaries skip over. Most of the men who survived those winters did not die of cold or starvation or violence. Most of them died slowly, years later, in cabins in frontier towns, from things that had no name in the medical books of the time. They drank themselves to death. They wandered off into the woods one autumn and never came back. They sat by the fire and stopped speaking and stopped eating, and one morning they were just gone. The old trappers had a phrase for it. They called it the winter sickness, even though it had nothing to do with winter anymore. It was the memory of what they had eaten. It was the memory of what they had crawled inside of. It was the memory of the men who hadn't made it, the partners they had buried, and sometimes the partners they hadn't buried. Hugh Glass survived the bear. He survived the betrayal. He survived 200 miles of frozen country with a broken leg and a torn-out throat. He survived one of the most extreme physical ordeals any human being has ever lived through. But the man who walked into Fort Kiowa in the spring of 1824 was not the same man who had been left in that shallow grave the autumn before. Something stayed behind in the cold. Something always did. The mountains are full of those somethings. If you made it this far, you understand why this story does not get told the way it should. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the men and women who built the American frontier with their bare hands and paid for it in ways the history books are too polite to print. I have other stories. None of them are gentle.